Back in 1996, the gaming industry changed forever when Nintendo released Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64. It wasn't just another sequel starring Mario. It was a complete reinvention of what platforming games could be. For a lot of gamers, this was the first time they truly felt freedom in a 3D world. You weren't just running left and right anymore. You were exploring giant open environments, experimenting with movement, and discovering secrets hidden in every corner of Peach's castle. Super Mario 64 became one of the most influential games ever made, inspiring generations of 3D platformers that followed. Then, nearly a decade later, Nintendo decided to revisit that legendary game in a way that nobody really expected. In 2004, alongside the launch of the Nintendo DS, Nintendo released Super Mario 64 DS. On the surface, it looked like a simple handheld port of a Nintendo 64 classic, but once people actually got their hands on it, they realized this was something much bigger. This wasn't just Mario 64 squeezed onto a portable system. Nintendo added new characters, new stars, multiplayer, mini-games, improved visuals, and entirely new content. At the same time, the game introduced one massive issue that has followed it for over 20 years: the controls. So now in 2026, with modern hardware, emulation, remasters, and countless ways to experience classic Nintendo games, the big question is this: is Super Mario 64 DS still worth playing today? Or is it simply a relic of the early Nintendo DS era that's been surpassed by better ways to play Mario 64? Before we dive deep into this video, if you enjoy retro gaming discussions, revisiting classic games, modern gaming commentary, and figuring out whether older titles still hold up years later, make sure to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Also, if you want even more gaming content from me, check out my Patreon, where my latest Patreon exclusive video is why survival games keep captivating players. Your support there helps support the channel and allows me to continue making more content like this. To really understand why Super Mario 64 DS mattered so much, you have to remember what gaming looked like in 2004. The Nintendo DS itself was a huge gamble. Nintendo was entering the handheld market with this strange dual-screen device that looked nothing like the Game Boy. It had a touchscreen, a microphone, wireless functionality, and a completely different design philosophy from anything else on the market. At the time, many people thought the Nintendo DS was going to fail. Even Nintendo fans weren't entirely sure about it. The PlayStation Portable looked far more powerful and modern, while the DS looked experimental and weird. Nintendo needed a launch title that would instantly grab people's attention and show off what the system could do. That's where Super Mario 64 DS came in. On paper, bringing Mario 64 to a handheld system sounded almost impossible. The original game was heavily designed around the Nintendo 64 controller and its analog stick. The DS didn't have an analog stick at all. It only had a D-pad. That alone sounded like a recipe for disaster. But Nintendo didn't just port the game over anyway. They actually rebuilt huge portions of it. The graphics were improved with cleaner character models and sharper textures. The castle now contained more secrets and unlockables. Instead of starting as Mario, players actually began the game as Yoshi, and Mario himself became a character you had to rescue. Luigi and Wario were also added as fully playable characters, each with their own unique abilities and exclusive stars. Nintendo even added dozens of touchscreen minigames that became one of the most memorable parts of the experience for many DS owners. At the time, this was honestly one of the most impressive handheld games ever made. Seeing a fully 3D Mario game running on a portable system felt unbelievable in 2004. A lot of people who were too young to own a Nintendo 64 experienced Mario 64 for the very first time through this DS remake. For an entire generation of players, this wasn't the weird handheld version. This was their Mario 64. That's important because nostalgia for this game often depends on which version people grew up with first. If you played the original Nintendo 64 release back in the day, Super Mario 64 DS can feel awkward and compromised. But if you grew up with the DS version, many of its differences feel completely natural. One of the biggest reasons this game still remains worth playing in 2026 is because the foundation underneath everything is still phenomenal. At its core, this is still Super Mario 64, and Super Mario 64 remains one of the greatest platformers ever created. The level design still holds up incredibly well. Bob-omb Battlefield remains one of the best introductory levels in gaming history because it immediately teaches the player how 3D movement works while still rewarding exploration. Cool Cool Mountain perfectly balances platforming and experimentation. Hazy Maze Cave feels mysterious and unpredictable. Big Boo's Haunt creates an atmosphere that still stands out decades later. Tick Tock Clock remains one of the most stressful and brilliantly designed platforming stages ever made. These levels still feel like playgrounds rather than linear obstacle courses. Modern games often guide players very carefully from point A to point B, but Mario 64 gives players freedom. It encourages curiosity. Sometimes you'll enter a level intending to grab one specific star and end up spending 30 minutes just messing around because the movement and exploration are fun on their own. That sense of freedom is a huge reason why Mario 64 has survived for so long. Even today, many modern 3D platformers still borrow ideas from it. You can see Mario 64's DNA in games like A Hat in Time, Astro Bot, and even parts of Super Mario Odyssey. The structure of entering a world, discovering objects organically, and experimenting with movement still feels timeless. Super Mario 64 DS preserves all of that. The game still captures the feeling of entering a giant sandbox and simply seeing what you can discover. Where the DS version really starts to separate itself from the original game is with its expanded content. Nintendo could have just released a straightforward portable port and called it a day, but instead they treated this game almost like a reimagining. The addition of Luigi and Wario dramatically changes how certain levels play. Luigi's backflip gives him incredible vertical movement, while Wario's strength allows him to break objects that nobody else can. Yoshi's unique abilities also make early sections of the game feel very different from the original release. Certain stars can only be collected with specific characters, which gives the game more replay value because you're encouraged to revisit levels from different perspectives. Then there's the star count itself. The original Mario 64 had 120 stars. Super Mario 64 DS increases that number to 150. There's a substantial amount of additional content. Some of the new stars are excellent additions that naturally fit into the game world, while others can feel a little repetitive, but overall the expanded content gives longtime Mario 64 fans new reasons to explore familiar environments again. There's something genuinely satisfying about revisiting levels you already know and discovering completely new objectives hidden inside them. The minigames are another major part of why this game still has value today. It's honestly easy to forget just how addictive these minigames were during the DS era. Luigi's poker game, Yoshi's puzzle challenges, Mario's card matching games, and Wario's reflex-based activities became perfect time killers for road trips, school breaks, or short gaming sessions. In many ways, the minigames felt like Nintendo experimenting with concepts that would later influence games like New Super Mario Bros., Mario Party DS, and even some touchscreen mechanics in future Nintendo titles. While the minigames obviously aren't deep experiences on their own, they add charm and variety to the overall package. They also represent a very specific movement in Nintendo history where the company was aggressively experimenting with touchscreen gaming before smartphones completely changed portable gaming forever. Visually, Super Mario 64 DS still holds up surprisingly well considering the hardware limitations. Obviously, nobody is going to mistake this for a modern game, but Nintendo did a fantastic job updating the original Nintendo 64 visuals for the DS hardware. Character models are smoother, environments are cleaner, and the art direction still shines through. The game retains that colorful toy-like Nintendo charm that ages far better than many realistic games from the same era. While some textures are still simplistic and the frame rate can occasionally feel rough by modern standards, the game remains very playable visually. In fact, playing it on a Nintendo 3DS or through modern emulation often makes the visuals look even sharper. Now, unfortunately, we need to talk about the biggest issue with Super Mario 64 DS because this is the thing that will determine whether or not the game clicks with you in 2026: the controls. The original Mario 64 was revolutionary partly because of how well it used the Nintendo 64 analog stick. Mario's movement felt smooth, flexible, and responsive in a way that was groundbreaking for 3D gaming. The DS version had to somehow recreate that movement using only a D-pad, and while Nintendo tried their best, there's no escaping the fact that the controls feel compromised. Precise platforming becomes significantly harder, small adjustments during jumps feel less natural, turning can feel stiff, certain sections that were easy in the original game suddenly become frustrating because the movement lacks the same fluidity. Back in 2004, Nintendo attempted to solve this issue with touchscreen controls. Players could use the touchscreen as a virtual analog pad using the stylus or thumb strap that came packaged with the system. The problem is that this method never really felt comfortable for many players. Some people adapted to it over time, but for others, it always felt awkward. In 2026, after years of smooth, dual analog controls becoming the standard across gaming, these control limitations feel even more noticeable. What makes this issue especially frustrating is that underneath these controls is still an incredible game. There are moments in Super Mario 64 DS where you can clearly see how amazing the experience could have been with proper analog movement. That's actually why many modern players now turn to alternative ways of playing the game. On modded systems and emulators, players can use analog stick patches that dramatically improve the experience. Suddenly, movement becomes smoother, platforming feels more natural, and many of the frustrations disappear. The existence of these modern enhancements actually helps Super Mario 64 DS tremendously in 2026 because they allow players to experience the game closer to the way it probably should have controlled from the start. Another interesting thing about revisiting this game today is how ambitious it feels compared to many modern remasters. Nowadays, companies often release very basic ports with minimal effort put into them. Super Mario 64 DS wasn't content with being a simple re-release. Nintendo genuinely tried to create a new experience. Even when some ideas didn't fully work, you could still appreciate the ambition behind them. Multiplayer mode, while fairly limited, was still impressive for a handheld launch title in 2004. The additional characters, stars, and minigames gave players a reason to revisit a game many had already played countless times before. Nintendo could have taken the easy route, but instead they experimented. That experimental feeling is honestly part of what makes the Nintendo DS era so memorable. The DS library was filled with weird ideas, touchscreen experiments, and unconventional design choices. Some worked brilliantly, while others didn't, but the era itself felt creative in a way that's sometimes missing from modern gaming. Super Mario 64 DS perfectly represents that mindset. It's flawed, but it's also fascinating. One thing I think modern players will appreciate more in 2026 is just how much content is packed into this game. Compared to many modern releases filled with microtransactions, season passes, and constant monetization, Super Mario 64 DS feels refreshingly complete. You buy the game and immediately have access to a huge amount of content. Multiple playable characters, dozens of stars, mini games, multiplayer secrets, unlockables, and replayability are all included from the start. There's something refreshing about revisiting older Nintendo games and remembering how focused they were on pure gameplay value. The soundtrack also deserves credit because it remains incredibly memorable. Most of the music comes directly from the original Mario 64, which means you still have legendary tracks like Dire Dire Docks, Slider, and Bomb Battlefield. These songs remain instantly recognizable to generations of gamers. Even decades later, hearing these tracks immediately transports people back to their childhoods. Nintendo's music from this era had an incredible ability to create atmosphere, while also becoming permanently burned into players' memories. Now, the big question becomes whether Super Mario 64 DS is worth playing specifically over the original version in 2026. Personally, I don't think the DS version replaces the original game. The Nintendo 64 version still delivers the purest form of Mario 64's movement and design philosophy. Mario controls better there, and that alone matters a lot in a platformer. But the DS version offers enough unique content that I don't think it should be dismissed as inferior either. Instead, I see these games as companion experiences. The original is the tighter, more focused classic, while the DS version is the expanded remix packed with extra ideas and experimentation. For players who have already played the original Mario 64 multiple times, Super Mario 64 DS can actually feel refreshing because of how different it is. Familiar levels suddenly contain new objectives, different characters create alternate strategies, hidden content encourages deeper exploration. It gives longtime fans a reason to revisit a game they may already know by heart. At the same time, I think new players should understand exactly what they're getting into. If someone has never played Mario 64 before and wants the smoothest possible introduction to the game, I'd probably recommend the original version or Super Mario 3D All-Stars first. But if someone is curious about Nintendo history, loves the DS era, or wants to experience one of the most ambitious handheld remakes ever made, then Super Mario 64 DS is absolutely still worth playing. What's fascinating about this game in 2026 is that it almost feels like an alternate timeline version of Mario 64. It's familiar enough to trigger nostalgia, but different enough to feel fresh. That balance made it stand out from many other remakes and remasters. Even with its flaws, it has its own identity. And honestly, I think that identity matters more now than ever. In an era where so many remasters feel safe and predictable, there's something admirable about a remake that took risk. Not every risk paid off, but Nintendo clearly wanted Super Mario 64 DS to feel meaningful rather than disposable. More than 20 years later, people are still debating this version because it left an impression. So is Super Mario 64 DS worth playing in 2026? I'd say yes, absolutely, but with some important caveats. If you can play it with modern enhancements like analog stick support, the experience becomes significantly better. If you're willing to accept slightly awkward controls in exchange for a ton of extra content, you'll probably have a great time. And if you love Nintendo history or the Nintendo DS era specifically, this game feels essential. Super Mario 64 DS is not the definitive version of Mario 64, but it was never really trying to be. Instead, it stands as a strange, ambitious, content packed reimagining of one of gaming's greatest masterpieces. It's flawed, experimental, occasionally frustrating, but also incredibly charming and surprisingly impressive even decades later. In many ways, that makes it one of the most interesting Nintendo remakes ever made. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more discussions about classic games and whether they still hold up today, make sure to give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And again, if you'd like to support the channel even further, check out my Patreon, where my latest Patreon exclusive video is why survival games keep captivating players. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, game on.